A millionaire returns home and finds his little girl searching through trash for bread, her hands bruised and her vision fading. She whispers, "Dad, I can't see straight," before collapsing into the shadows she's been surviving in alone. As he uncovers hidden notes, secret hiding spots, and the truth she lived in silence, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear: she was never afraid of the world, she was afraid of being invisible to him. As he walked toward the front entrance, he heard it, a faint rustling near the side of the house. At first, he assumed it was the wind shifting through the shrubs or maybe a stray animal knocking something over. His property was large and bordered by woodland, unusual sounds weren't rare. Yet something about this rustle was different. It carried a rhythm, a carefulness, like someone moving with deliberate caution. His steps slowed, the exhaustion in his body dulled slightly beneath a sharp flicker of alertness. He turned his head, eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the exterior lights. The side path that led toward the service bins was partially shadowed, with only a sliver of moonlight reaching it. That was when he saw her. A small figure crouched beside the trash bins, her thin frame almost swallowed by the oversized hoodie she wore. Her hair, long, tangled, and dusty, fell over her face as she leaned into the open lid of the bin. Her hands moved quickly, but not desperately. She sifted through discarded cartons and crumpled paper as though she had done this before. As though she knew exactly what she was looking for. Frozen in place, Leonard blinked hard, thinking fatigue was distorting what he saw. A child rummaging in his trash. On his property. The thought didn't make sense. His house sat behind tall gates, guarded from the outside world. Yet here she was, a small, fragile figure digging through the remnants of his life, searching quietly, methodically, as if hunger had long since replaced fear. The world around him fell into a strange hush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Something inside him, the part that had spent years buried beneath ambition and distraction, stirred sharply. He didn't feel threatened. He felt unsettled in a way he couldn't explain. He stepped forward, slow and careful so he wouldn't startle her. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes, and for a brief second, she froze. Her shoulders stiffened, her head lifting just slightly, though she didn't turn around. She kept her hand buried in the bin, fingers searching, as if she had learned to keep moving even when danger approached. Leonard took another step, his chest tightening. The closer he got, the clearer her shape became. She was young, too young to be out here alone. The sleeves of her hoodie were frayed at the ends, hanging loosely past her wrists. He glimpsed her hands, and even in the low light, he saw how raw they looked. The skin was reddened, scraped, as though she had climbed through tight spaces or crawled across rough ground more than once. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing formed. Words felt wrong, too loud for a child who moved like silence was her closest companion. Instead, he approached slowly, the soft scuff of his shoes becoming the only sound between them. The air thickened, heavy with the weight of a moment he didn't understand yet. The girl shifted again, this time lifting her head just enough that he saw the outline of her face. Pale skin, thin cheeks, hair falling over wide, careful eyes. She pulled her hand from the bin clutching a torn piece of bread, old, stale, crumbled along the edges. She dusted it off with trembling fingers, brushing away specks of dirt and wrappers. Leonard felt something inside him twist. He wasn't sure what it was, guilt, shock, disbelief, but it gripped him hard enough to hold him still. He had built a life defined by abundance, yet here on the edge of his perfect property, a child was scavenging for survival. He stepped closer, now only a few feet away. The movement finally caused her to turn. Slowly, stiffly, her eyes met his, and in that instant, something raw flickered in him, not panic, not defiance, but exhaustion. A deep weariness far too heavy for someone so small. She tried to stand but faltered. Her legs wobbled beneath her, knees dipping inward. The piece of bread slipped from her hand, falling to the ground. Leonard instinctively reached out, but she lifted a hand weakly, as though trying to find balance. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls, and her gaze wavered as if the world had stopped staying still for her. He took another slow step, lowering his hand gently, silently offering support without forcing it. Her eyelids fluttered, her head tilting slightly to one side as though her vision blurred. She opened her mouth, her voice small, fragile, cracking through the quiet like a thread snapping under strain. I can't see straight." The words drifted into the cold air with heartbreaking softness. Leonard felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but emotionally, a sudden tilt that made everything inside him drop. Whatever exhaustion he carried vanished instantly, replaced by a heavy, urgent dread. He reached out again, slower this time, cautious not to startle her further. But before he could reach her, before he could decide how to respond, the girl swayed, her legs buckling slightly. She caught herself against the bin, fingers curling around the metal edge with a strength that didn't match her small frame. She blinked hard, her gaze unfocused, drifting past him rather than at him. He moved closer, instinct overruling hesitation. Something in her condition wasn't right: hunger, dizziness, disorientation. The signs were all there, each one sharper now that he stood only inches away. He whispered her name in his mind even though he didn't know it yet. The ache in his chest made her existence feel familiar in a way he didn't understand. Then, just as he stepped into her shadow, ready to catch her if she fell, something behind her shifted. A soft, low sound from deeper within the trash alcove. A movement he hadn't expected. A shadow slipping along the wall. And before he could react, the girl's head snapped toward it. As though, for a long moment, Leonard stood between two worlds that had no business touching: his own, built on polished surfaces and steady income, and hers, formed out of hunger, exhaustion, and the desperate instinct to keep moving. The small sound behind the trash alcove faded into the night, but its echo stayed with him. It made the scene at his feet feel less like an isolated moment and more like a glimpse into an ongoing struggle. The girl's thin shoulders remained tense, her grip on the bin unsteady, her breathing shallow. Everything about her posture spoke of someone who had learned to survive by staying quiet and unnoticed, even when her body demanded help. He became acutely aware of the contrast around them. Just beyond the stone path, the expansive windows of his home revealed warm light spilling over hardwood floors, framed artwork, and carefully placed furniture. A kitchen inside held more food than this child had likely seen in weeks. A stocked pantry, a refrigerator humming with abundance. A dining table that sat six, though it rarely saw more than one plate at a time. Behind him was a life of excess, before him was a small figure who had resorted to digging through his trash just to soften the edge of hunger. The reality of it settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had driven past countless headlines and charity campaigns, all talking about invisible poverty and children going to bed hungry. He had written checks, funded programs, and reassured himself that he was doing his part. Yet none of that prepared him for the sight of one malnourished child leaning over his trash, her world colliding with his in the most literal way possible. Numbers on a report were one thing. Bruised hands reaching for stale bread on his property were another. As he steadied himself, the girl pushed off the bin, using its metal surface for balance. Her legs trembled beneath her. She seemed to be gauging whether she had enough strength to move, to escape, to disappear back into whatever shelter she had claimed as her own. Her hesitation spoke volumes. This place was not new to her. The path was familiar. The angle at which she stepped away from the bin showed practiced caution. She knew where the shadows fell, which parts of the yard stayed darkest, which lines of sight to avoid when moving past lit windows. Leonard realized she hadn't chosen his house at random. She had been here before. Perhaps many times. How many nights had she visited his trash in silence while he sat in his office, unaware that someone on the other side of the wall was fighting to stay upright? How many evenings had she watched his lights from the safety of darkness, knowing food was just yards away yet completely out of reach? The girl steadied herself and began to move along the side of the house, her steps short and deliberate. She stayed close to the wall, hugging the narrow strip of shadow between the stone and the shrubs, avoiding open spaces where motion sensors might detect her. Her body language held no hint of rebellion or defiance. It was all survival. Every pause, every scan of her surroundings, every adjustment of her footing, each act was the product of instinct honed by too many days and nights spent on the edge of collapse. Leonard followed at a careful distance, not wanting to frighten her but unable to let her disappear into the dark without understanding more. He watched the small impressions her shoes left in the soft soil near the foundation, the slight drag in her steps when she grew unsteady, the way her hand occasionally brushed against the wall as though she needed the solidity to stay upright. He stayed far enough back that she likely only sensed movement rather than feeling actively pursued. His world of luxury pressed in on him from every side. The exterior lighting had been designed to give the property a warm, welcoming glow, highlighting the landscaping and stonework. Tonight, those lights seemed almost accusatory, highlighting all he had while exposing what she lacked. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the hedges sculpted, the pathways clean. It was a scene out of a magazine, glossy and admired by strangers. And in the midst of it, a girl with tangled hair and bruised hands moved like a ghost, slipping through spaces no one thought to look at closely. She reached the far end of the house and paused, breathing shallow as she peered around the corner. Leonard slowed his steps as well, staying behind the line of the wall. He could hear a faint hitch in her breathing, the kind that came from someone pushing past the limits of exhaustion. She cautiously stepped into the backyard, where the house opened into a broad, open space that overlooked a line of trees. Beyond the patio and manicured grass, shadows pooled where the property met the wooded edge. He watched her bypass the main patio door entirely. She didn't glance at the outdoor furniture or the glass doors leading to the warm interior. Instead, she followed the narrow line where the yard met the side of the garage. It was an area he rarely noticed, a transitional strip of ground between the manicured space and a small utility structure built near the back, originally intended to store tools, gardening equipment, and project materials he never had time to use. The girl's footsteps grew more tentative as she neared the structure. The small building was partially shielded by overgrown shrubs, its faded paint and aging door making it an afterthought on a property built to impress. Leonard rarely went there. He had almost forgotten it existed. She moved toward it with familiarity. His chest tightened as he watched her slip around the side of the structure, where the light from the house barely reached. He followed slowly, careful not to trample the faint marks she left in the grass. As he rounded the corner, he saw what his lighting and landscaping had never revealed to him, a narrow patch of ground between the back of the utility building and the fence line, partially concealed by low tree branches and the angle of the property. There, pressed against the back wall of the structure, was a small cluster of things that did not belong to him. A thin blanket, wadded and worn, lay folded near the base of the wall. Beside it, an empty water bottle stood upright, positioned as if it had been refilled and reused many times. A pair of shoes, smaller than any belonging to an adult, sat neatly side by side near a patch of flattened grass that looked suspiciously like a makeshift sleeping area. Leonard's breath hitched. This was not a random hiding place or a temporary stop. This was a camp, a shelter, a fragile, makeshift life wedged into the blind spot of his carefully curated property. Footsteps had led him here. Her footsteps, tiny imprints that traced a path between the trash bins and this hidden corner, a route she must have taken repeatedly, perhaps every night. The girl moved toward the blanket with slow familiarity, one hand brushing the wall for balance. She sagged to a crouch, her movements clumsy and tired, fingers reaching to straighten the folded fabric as though it were the closest thing she had to comfort. In that moment, the contrast between their worlds reached a breaking point. He had spent years living in a fortress of abundance, certain the worst kind of suffering lived far beyond his gates. But the truth stood only a few yards from his kitchen window. A child had been surviving in the shadows of his wealth. And as he stared at the warm blanket and the flattened patch of grass tucked behind his own outbuilding, Leonard realized with a cold, sinking certainty that this little girl had been living much closer than he ever imagined, close enough to hear the sounds of his life through the walls every single night. He'd been expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Leonard remained half hidden in the shadow of the utility building, unable to pull his gaze away from the small figure crouched in the dirt. The girl sat beside the warm blanket with a kind of practiced exhaustion, her movements slow, deliberate, shaped by someone who had learned to ration her energy. When she leaned forward to adjust the blanket, the faint spill of porch light brushing across her hands revealed details he hadn't fully seen earlier. Her hands were small, fragile, and covered in marks that didn't belong on any child. The skin was reddened along her palms, scraped across the knuckles, the kind of scrapes that came not from one accident but from repeated contact with rough surfaces. Tiny abrasions lined the sides of her fingers, each one healed just enough to show they weren't new, but not old enough to have faded. Some spots were raw, irritated, as though she had been using her hands as tools rather than limbs, scrubbing, digging, climbing, gripping cold metal or rough wood. He swallowed hard, the sight of them sinking into him deeper than he was prepared for. These weren't the hands of a child who wandered briefly or played too roughly. These were survival marks, the physical proof of nights spent searching through trash, days spent crawling into shelter, hours spent carrying the weight of hunger alone. Children didn't naturally develop this pattern of bruises unless life forced them to. The sight pulled him fully out of the bubble of his own exhaustion. He stepped closer, not announcing himself but drawn forward by an instinct stronger than hesitation. As he moved, the girl stiffened. She didn't turn to face him but held still in a way that said she heard every shift of the grass beneath his shoes. Her shoulders rose slightly, her back tightening, not in fear of aggression, but in fear of being seen. A child used to hiding expected trouble whenever footsteps came too close. Leonard stopped far enough behind her to give her space. He didn't want to corner her, didn't want to push her further into the small nook she had claimed as safety. The air was thick with silence, the kind that forms when someone knows they're not alone but isn't ready to acknowledge it. The distant hum of the house's outdoor lights buzzed faintly, underscoring the stark difference between the world she came from and the one he lived in. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to the level of her small shelter without closing the distance completely. Even from several feet away, her hands were clear under the dim light, hands that had scraped along fences, wedged under boards, pushed through trash bags, gripped cold surfaces for balance. There was no single injury that alarmed him. It was the accumulation, the quiet story told in lines, scrapes, bruises, and healed over cuts. Children express truth physically when words failed them, and her hands were the loudest confession she had. He thought back to the moment she whispered that she couldn't see straight. Her dizziness now carried a heavier meaning. Hunger, dehydration, exhaustion, any of these could distort vision. And judging by her fragile frame and battered hands, she had endured more than any child should. The girl shifted again, turning slightly as if debating whether to face him or flee. Her hair moved just enough for him to glimpse her profile, soft features sharpened by months of strain. She reached for the battered shoes placed beside the blanket, slipping them on with a quiet resignation. The gesture was routine, practiced, almost mechanical. It struck him profoundly. She was preparing to leave, to move again, to disappear back into the cold edges of the night where she had survived alone for so long. A gentle wind moved through the yard, stirring the branches overhead. It swept past the utility structure, brushing against the fence behind the shed, bringing with it the faint fluttering sound of something clinging loosely to wood. The sound pulled Leonard's attention. He rose slowly, turning toward the fence line where the shed's shadow stretched into the darker patch of the yard. There, caught on a rough splinter in the weathered slats, was a torn piece of fabric. It fluttered weakly in the breeze, faintly illuminated by the spill of light from the house. He stepped closer, drawn to it with a sinking sense of recognition. The fabric was thin, soft, worn nearly to transparency at the edges. A faded pattern of tiny stars, light blue and white, decorated its surface. The tear along one side matched the frayed edges of the girl's dress perfectly. His stomach tightened. This was another piece of her story, another silent confession left behind by nights spent climbing fences or squeezing through tight gaps for shelter. The tear wasn't clean, it looked snagged, pulled forcefully by wood when she tried to slip past. The height of the snag, just above his knee, aligned with the height she would hit if she crawled through quickly or fell against it. He reached out slowly and touched the fabric. It was cold from the night air but soft in a way that only something constantly warm would be. The small stars mirrored the warm prints on her dress, confirming what he already knew. She hadn't been here once. She had used this path repeatedly, enough times for her clothing to bear the marks of it. Behind him, he heard the subtle shift of gravel. The girl had turned toward him. He didn't look back right away, not wanting to overwhelm her, but he felt her gaze. Not accusatory, not fearful, just weary. A child who expected nothing, not help, not kindness, not recognition. A child who had learned to expect silence from the world. He let the piece of cloth fall from his fingers gently. It settled back against the fence, fluttering once more like a quiet reminder of her past movements. He turned just slightly, enough to see her standing now, thin arms held close to her body, one hand gripping her wrist as though grounding herself. Her eyes were focused downward, not meeting his. But her posture told him everything. She had seen him notice the cloth. She had seen him piece together the connection. And now she waited, still, silent, braced for something. Not punishment, not anger, just reaction. She stood like a child who expected to be misunderstood. Leonard felt a deep, wrenching pressure in his chest as he took a slow breath. The night around them seemed to hold still again, letting the weight of discovery settle fully between them. Her bruised hands had told one story. The torn fabric told another. Together, they painted a truth he could no longer ignore. This child had been navigating his property for far longer than he realized, and the path she walked was not random. She had been surviving in the smallest cracks between his abundance and her desperation. And as he stared at the torn piece of cloth clinging weakly to the fence, fluttering like a fragile signal from her past, he realized something with chilling clarity. He was only beginning to uncover how close she had been all along. Leonard stood in the yard longer than he intended, the torn cloth still fluttering softly on the fence as though whispering truths he had never bothered to hear. The wind settled, and the night regained its quiet, but nothing inside him felt still. The girl, small, thin, and trembling, remained near the warm blanket, watching him with guarded eyes that carried both fear and weariness. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched, weighted by a history he didn't yet understand but knew he had been part of without realizing it. As he looked at her, memories he had locked behind ambition began to push their way forward. Not dramatic ones, not painful ones, the small, ordinary moments that should have mattered but didn't, because he'd convinced himself other things mattered more. He remembered coming home late, night after night, slipping into a quiet house long after dinner had been cleared away. He remembered the soft glow of lights left on for him, illuminating empty rooms, untouched toys, and a dinner plate covered with plastic wrap that had long since cooled. He had believed she was sleeping peacefully in her room upstairs. He never considered she might have needed him awake. He remembered mornings where she shuffled into the kitchen rubbing her eyes, her hair tangled, her voice soft as she greeted him. He would smile, pat her head, and leave early for meetings. Those small interactions had been enough for him, proof that he was trying. Proof that he was present, even when he wasn't. And he remembered the day things changed. The day the separation finalized. The day he told himself that she was resilient, that children adapted quickly, that she would adjust to a new schedule with time. He remembered saying goodbye at the door each week when she went to her mother's place, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. She always looked back once, as though checking for something she couldn't name. He had interpreted that as dependence he needed to help her grow out of. He thought encouraging independence was being a good parent. Now, watching her steal bread from his trash, her bruised hands trembling in the cold, he realized independence had been forced, not nurtured. Children didn't become self-sufficient out of strength. They became self-sufficient out of necessity. The girl, her thin frame, her hunger, her bruised hands, was the embodiment of all the moments he had missed while chasing success, stability, and respectability. Every time he walked into a room scanning for emails instead of faces. Every time he told himself he was doing it for her. Every time he placed work above time, presence, or understanding. The truth nestled into him heavily. The days he thought he was building a future, she had been enduring the present alone. His throat tightened as he shifted his gaze from the girl to the property around them. The house, the manicured lawn, the polished patio, everything he had built reflected his priorities. None of them reflected hers. He took a shallow breath and glanced toward the house, suddenly needing to step inside. Not to escape her presence, but because a new urgency was forming inside him, a need to understand what else he missed. A need to see the house through her eyes, not his. He turned back to her slowly, making sure his movements weren't abrupt. She didn't run, she simply watched him with that same wary stillness, as though waiting to see whether his next step would turn into a threat. It wasn't fear of violence, it was fear of disruption, fear of being forced away from the only place she'd found scraps of safety. He walked toward the house, each step sinking deeper into the quiet realization that he had been living beside a story he never asked to hear. Inside, the air felt warm, almost suffocating compared to the cold outside. The lights glowed across surfaces that had never held fingerprints or scattered toys. It struck him how pristine everything looked, untouched, unshared. It was a home without the evidence of a child's life. Without crumbs, without crayons, without misplaced shoes. Yet she had been here. Somewhere, somehow. The thought made him scan the room with new eyes. He walked through the kitchen slowly, tracing his hand along the counter, letting the hum of the refrigerator settle over him. The refrigerator he stocked weekly. The cabinets filled with meals meant for two but eaten alone. The dishwasher that rarely held anything more than a mug, a spoon, and the plate he used when he remembered to eat. Then he stopped at the doorway leading to the staircase. For the first time, he noticed something subtle. Dust was disturbed near the bottom step. Not by the broad pattern footprints made, but by something smaller. Something that brushed against the lower edge of the stairs underside. He crouched and swept his hand lightly across the floor. The dust shifted, forming a faint pattern, movement too small for an adult, too low for someone casually walking. His heart beat faster. He lifted his gaze and noticed something else, the faint scratch of displaced dust along the vertical face of the second step. A pattern that suggested someone had squeezed through the narrow space beneath the staircase. With a deep breath, he leaned down and peeked beneath the stairs. It was dark, cramped, a triangular cavity used only for wiring and support beams. Nothing about it looked inviting, yet his eyes caught on something wedged between the far beams. A dull, rectangular shape partially obscured by shadows. He reached in slowly, his fingers brushing against the rough surface of a small wooden box. It was dusty but clearly placed there intentionally. Its edges were worn smooth, and the metal clasp in front showed signs of repeated handling. He pulled it out carefully and sat back on the floor, the box resting in his lap. His throat tightened again as he realized this wasn't something he owned. It wasn't a misplaced household item. It belonged to her. It had the quiet, fragile weight of something a child kept close. He released the clasp with trembling fingers. The lid creaked open, and inside, he saw the first item, a small flashlight with fading batteries. Next to it lay a folded piece of cloth, thin and soft, the kind a child might use to stay warm. There were wrappers of old snacks, saved and smoothed flat, perhaps because she didn't know when she'd find food again. A bottle cap filled with dried drops of water, maybe used to measure or ration sips. And tucked into the corner was a small drawing on scrap paper, crude lines showing a little girl curled beside a fence under a patch of stars. Leonard exhaled shakily. Each item told a story of survival, not play. A story of nights where hunger gnawed at her. A story of cold evenings where she huddled behind walls he never thought to check. A story of a child who lived steps away from him, unseen, unheard, unnoticed. He closed the box gently, unable to bear the weight of its contents. The days he didn't know he missed stretched before him like a long, unbroken path, filled with her struggle and his absence. And as he lifted the box into his arms, something deep inside him shifted, a trembling understanding that he was only beginning to uncover how much she had endured while he lived unaware. Then, just as he pushed himself up from the floor, a faint sound echoed from outside, a shuffling movement near the yard, small and hurried, as though the little girl had sensed that something inside the house was changing, and she wasn't sure whether change meant safety or danger. The house felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because Leonard was finally learning how to see it. For years, he had walked through these rooms with the confidence of someone who believed he understood his home. He knew where the light switches were without looking, which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck slightly in humid weather. He knew the house as an owner, but he had never once studied it the way someone surviving inside it might. He carried the small box from beneath the stairs into the living room, placing it gently on the coffee table as if it were fragile, as if the weight of survival inside it might spill outward if he handled it wrong. His chest felt tight as he looked around, suddenly aware of how empty everything felt, how still, how curated, how untouched by anything resembling a child's presence. Homes that held children usually bore the marks of them, fingerprints on the fridge door, toys stuffed in corners, shoes kicked off near entryways, drawings taped to walls. His house held none of that. It held silence. It held order. It held the intentional neatness of someone who lived alone, even when he claimed he didn't. He moved slowly across the living room, scanning objects and corners he had long ignored. For the first time, he noticed how many of them had dust collected in perfect symmetry, a sign that no one had touched them, moved them, or interacted with them. Even the decorative vase on the shelf didn't have the faint smudge that came from a child brushing past. The throw pillows on the couch were exactly where the cleaning service placed them. The carpet had no uneven patches where small feet might have paced or sat cross-legged. This wasn't just a house, it was a display. He walked into the hallway next, letting his hand drift along the wall, feeling each indentation in the paint that he once assumed came from careless movers or old owners. Now those small marks seemed insignificant compared to what he was looking for, signs that the girl had been here, moving through the house quietly, existing in the empty spaces of his life. He reached the hallway leading to the guest rooms and paused. One door on the left stood slightly ajar, only by an inch, but enough for the faintest sliver of darkness to press through. That door was always closed. He rarely entered that room, and he certainly never left it open. He stepped closer, pushing the door open with the caution of someone expecting something to be on the other side. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the hallway light spilling in. The bed was made sharply, the corners tucked with perfection. The curtains were drawn tight, leaving the air still and untouched. But it wasn't the neatness that made him pause. It was the pattern on the carpet. Near the side of the bed, the carpet fibers were slightly flattened, not from footsteps, but from weight. Not adult weight, not the broad pattern of someone sitting casually. It was a small impression, circular on one side, elongated on the other, like a child sitting with her legs curled close, maybe hidden in the shadows beside the bed. He knelt, brushing his hand along the carpet, and felt his chest tighten. This wasn't random. Someone small had been here, sitting quietly, possibly for long stretches of time. Maybe she used this room on nights when the cold outside became unbearable. Maybe she entered when she believed he wasn't home. Maybe she hid here when the world outside her tiny shelter felt too overwhelming. He straightened slowly, scanning the rest of the room. Nothing else looked immediately disturbed, but the air held a faint chill that didn't match the rest of the house. He stepped back into the hallway, his eyes flicking to the other rooms. The bathroom down the hall looked pristine, but the small rug near the sink had a slight dent, as if someone knelt there often. The mirror had faint smudges at a height too low for him, small, uneven prints that could only belong to a child who had leaned close to see herself. He moved on, following the hallway deeper into the house. This section of the home was quiet even on normal days. The guest rooms, office, and storage areas rarely saw movement. But now his heart beat faster as he inspected each handle, each doorframe, each patch of floor. He passed the office and froze. The storage room door was slightly open. Only by a fraction, but enough to signal someone had been there recently. He pushed the door open fully, revealing boxes stacked neatly on shelves, seasonal decor in clear containers, and tools resting untouched along the wall. Everything looked organized, undisturbed. But then he saw it. In the far right corner of the room, between two stacked storage bins, lay a small indentation in the dust. A faint outline of a knee, then another beside it. A small handprint near the baseboard. And next to it, something that didn't belong at all, an overturned bowl with crumbs inside. His breath caught. This was where she'd eaten. This tight, cramped corner, hidden between boxes he never looked behind. A place where she could stay unnoticed, shielded by the silence of rooms he rarely entered. He slowly stepped back into the hallway, feeling the walls close in, not physically, but emotionally. This house had been full of noise in his mind, the noise of schedules, ambition, deadlines, responsibilities. But to her, it had been a place of quiet corners, dim hiding spots, unspoken rules. A maze designed by absence, not intention. He reached the end of the hallway and opened the last door, the room he almost never entered. The one closest to the backyard. The one used only for storage since he renovated the house years ago. He flicked on the light. The room was mostly empty now, just a mattress leaning against the wall, an old dresser he never replaced, and dust collecting in corners. But the walls caught his attention instantly. At first, they looked like scuff marks, the kind left by furniture being moved. But when he stepped closer, his stomach tightened. The marks weren't random. They were lines, small lines, clustered in groups, stacked vertically, arranged in rows. A child's height, a child's reach, a child's pattern. He moved closer, running his hand lightly along the wall. The marks were not drawn with crayons or markers, they were scraped in lightly, just enough to show. Possibly with a dull object. Possibly with a fingernail, a timeline, a record, a mark for each day she came. Or each night she survived. Or each moment she waited. He stepped back, heart pounding at the sight of dozens, maybe hundreds, of faint scratches. Not violent, not destructive, but quietly desperate. His vision blurred for a moment, a wave of guilt rushing through him so sharply he had to steady himself against the wall. These weren't markings of boredom. These were markings of a child counting days, counting time, counting moments alone. And as he stared at the wall, the truth settled over him with crushing weight. She had been in this house far more often than he ever realized. She had existed in the cracks, in the spaces he never lived in the corners he never bothered to look at. She had survived inside his silence. But before he could process any of it, something caught his eye, one mark near the bottom of the wall, different from the rest. Darker, more deliberate, almost shaped like a symbol rather than a line. He squinted, leaning closer. His stomach twisted sharply. Whatever that mark represented, it wasn't part of the pattern. It meant something else, something she hadn't been able to say. And he wasn't ready for the truth it held. Leonard stood frozen in the doorway, the faint scratches on the wall still imprinting themselves in his mind as though they were freshly made. The air around him felt heavier than the closed room could justify, thick with the presence of a child who had moved through these spaces with the caution of someone who learned early that survival depended on staying unnoticed. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, his chest tightening with a depth of guilt he had never experienced before. The marks on the wall were not random patterns. They were routine, habit, coping, and they were made by the same small hands he had seen outside, raw, bruised, trembling under moonlight. Those hands, he kept seeing them, crimson around the knuckles, scraped along the palms, marked by a life far colder than anything inside this house. He stepped back into the hallway, feeling as though the house itself had shifted into a different form around him, not a home of comfort, but a map of her survival. Every small detail he had once dismissed as quirks of a large property now gained new meaning, each one pointing to a child who had been navigating his world carefully, silently, fearfully. He walked slowly, scanning the spaces with the eyes of someone searching for evidence left in plain sight. The corners of the walls where dust was slightly disturbed. The lower edges of doorframes where small hands had steadied themselves. The faint indent on the carpet near the guest bathroom where her knees must have pressed as she tried to reach the sink. The house told her story now, and he could no longer look away. He moved toward the living room, replaying the image of her hands in his mind. He had seen scrapes like that before, but only on workers who handled rough materials or hikers who scaled rocky terrain. They weren't the marks of harm inflicted by someone else, they were the marks of harm endured through sheer necessity. He remembered the state of his property, the high stone fence, the narrow gaps beneath the storage shed, the rough boards along the back utility wall. She must have crawled through those spaces countless times, squeezing into tight corners where splintered wood and coarse gravel scraped her skin. She had climbed fences looking for scraps. She had dug through rough trash bags, bracing herself against metal lids and cold pavement. None of it was violence. All of it was survival. A child's body wasn't meant for that kind of world. Yet she carried all the signs of one who lived in the shadows, hidden from the comfort she could almost see but never touch. Leonard walked toward the staircase, but something made him stop, an instinct, a tug of awareness that there was still more he hadn't discovered. He turned toward the hallway that led to the storage room, a place he hadn't examined yet with the new lens of her presence. He moved through the quiet corridor, each step echoing slightly. At the end of the hallway stood the door to the storage room, still left half open from when he walked past it earlier. He pushed it wider, letting the soft overhead light spill across the stacked boxes and the unused tools. Dust stirred lightly in the air before settling back into place. The room looked ordinary at first, rows of labeled bins, holiday decorations, and old household items stacked neatly along shelves. But now he didn't look for order. He looked for disruption, for the subtle signs of a child's presence. He walked slowly between the shelves, eyes scanning the floor for impressions, dust patterns, anything that didn't belong. And then he saw it, near the far wall, partially hidden behind a tall stack of storage containers. A soft corner of fabric, barely visible, as though someone had pushed it behind the boxes hurriedly. He felt something tighten in his chest as he moved closer. The boxes weren't heavy, but they formed a barrier, a kind of shield that someone small might have constructed for privacy. He reached out and pulled one aside, then another, creating just enough space to reveal what lay behind them. A folded blanket, thin, frayed at the edges, filled with wear, colored a muted gray that might have once been white. He crouched down and touched it with trembling fingers. The fabric was softer than he expected, not because it was luxurious, but because it had been handled countless times. Comforted against cold nights, thread across hard floors, pressed beneath small limbs curled for warmth. He lifted it gently, and the faintest scent of stale air and something earthy rose from it, the smell of nights spent tucked in hidden corners. Nights spent behind the shed. Nights spent under the stairs. Nights spent inside his home without him ever knowing. It wasn't just a blanket. It was evidence of her existence. Her persistence, her need to carve out safety wherever she could find it. He sat back on the floor, the blanket draped across his lap. It felt impossibly small, too small to provide warmth, too thin to protect her from the cold floors or the sharp edges of the spaces she hid in. Yet she had kept it. She had folded it. She had returned to it again and again. He pictured her crawling into the storage room through the side door that stuck slightly, a door he had ignored for years because it never caused him trouble. Now he understood why the bottom corner of the frame had faint scratches. Why the rug near the threshold was slightly displaced. Why the dust gathered unevenly in the far corner where she slept. He imagined her curled behind the stack of boxes, pressing the blanket around her small frame as the house settled in the night. Imagining warmth where there wasn't any. Imagining safety where she didn't truly feel it. Imagining she could exist here just long enough to gather strength before the next day required her to survive all over again. Leonard pressed the blanket to his chest, unable to ignore the weight of it. It was too light for comfort, too thin for protection. But in her hands, it had been the closest thing to home she had. He stood slowly, the blanket draped over his arm. The room felt colder now, the air pressing in with the realization of what she had endured within these walls. This house, built with every luxury he could afford, had been a shelter for him and a labyrinth for her. He turned toward the doorway, ready to check the next room, to see what else he had missed. But as he stepped into the hall, something in the corner of his eye caught his attention again, a faint shade behind the doorframe, just out of sight. A small, very small, indentation in the wall, at the height of a child's head. A place where she might have leaned, listening for footsteps, waiting for silence, waiting for safety, waiting for him. And as he stared at that indentation, heart thudding painfully, he knew he wasn't just uncovering where she had slept. He was uncovering every moment she had lived in fear inside a home she never truly entered. Before he could step forward, a soft rustling sound drifted from the hallway, a movement too deliberate to be the house settling. She was close, she had moved again, and now he wasn't sure whether she was running from him, or finally. The blanket hanging over Leonard's arm felt heavier than its actual weight, as though it carried the cold nights she had endured and the countless moments she folded herself into corners of his home. He stood in the hallway listening for the subtle shift of movement he'd heard moments before, but the house had fallen silent again, its stillness stretching out in a way that made every sound feel amplified. He glanced toward the living room, the kitchen, the staircase, trying to sense where she had gone. Yet, as he moved deeper into the house, he felt a pull not toward her presence but toward the lingering pieces of her absence. He walked to the office next, a room that had always been his sanctuary for paperwork he barely finished and meetings he took from home but never seemed present for. The space was large, lined with shelves and a polished wooden desk centered neatly between two tall windows. He flicked on the light and let his gaze drift across the room. Nothing appeared out of place, everything was arranged exactly how he left it. But he had learned not to trust appearances. He stepped closer to the desk and noticed something small near the edge of the floor, a crumpled scrap of paper tucked almost deliberately beneath one of the chair legs. He knelt slowly, lifting the chair with one hand and retrieving the paper with the other. It was thin, slightly torn, and smudged with faint dirt. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting inside was small, uneven, the letters cramped and slightly tilted. It wasn't the handwriting of confidence. It was the handwriting of a child who wrote with hesitation. 3 words appeared on the scrap: "My head spins." Leonard stared at the note, pulse tightening. He remembered her voice outside, the tremble in her words when she whispered that she couldn't see straight. This note, crushed, hidden, nearly discarded, held the truth she never had the courage to say aloud. Hunger didn't just hollow the stomach. It weakened the body. It blurred vision. It made the world tilt. He folded the note with trembling fingers and tucked it gently onto his desk. Then he scanned the room again, eyes searching for more. Another scrap caught his attention near the bookshelf, a corner of white peeking from beneath a heavy hardcover. He lifted the book and retrieved the paper. This one was less crumpled but stained with something that looked like water, perhaps rain she tracked in, or condensation from a cup she found and used carefully. He smoothed the paper on the desk. The message was slightly longer, though still written with shaky lines. "Too cold. Hurts to sleep." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words settle. She had tried to sleep in his home. In its corners, in its forgotten spaces, with nothing but a thin blanket and hope. The drafts he never noticed, the cold spots he ignored, she had felt them intimately, painfully. He walked toward the filing cabinet, drawn by another faint glimmer of white. When he pulled open the lowest drawer, a small stack of papers slid forward, scraps torn from old envelopes, receipts, and notebook edges. All had been tucked behind the files, as though pushed hastily when footsteps approached. He gathered them all, carrying them to the desk where he could see them in the warm light. One by one, he unfolded each note, each message revealing another layer of a child struggling to make sense of her world. "Hungry again. My tummy makes noise. I hide when I feel sick. The floor too hard. Want to stay warm." Each line carved deeper into him. Each word was a whisper of need she never dared say aloud. This was not a child seeking mischief or adventure. She was seeking survival, safety, warmth, something as simple as feeling okay inside her own body. As he sifted through the notes, one caught the edge of his attention immediately. Unlike the others, this scrap was folded more neatly, preserved better, as though she had kept it close for longer. He hesitated before unfolding it, sensing this one held something heavier. When he opened it, his breath caught. The handwriting was still small, still uneven, but the message was different, emotional, not physical. "The man never sees me." Leonard felt the air leave his lungs. His fingers tightened around the paper. He read the line again, slower this time, his eyes tracing every letter. It wasn't written in anger. It wasn't written in accusation. It was written in quiet resignation. He could imagine her sitting in some corner of the house, clutching a pen borrowed or found, trying to make sense of her invisibility. Perhaps she saw the lights on in his office, saw him moving through rooms, saw him living in a mansion she tried to survive inside the edges of, yet he never saw her. Not really, not fully, not in the moments she needed him most. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around the weight of the truth. He placed the note carefully beside the others and stepped back from the desk, needing space to breathe. He walked toward the closet at the far end of the office, a place he rarely entered. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. Inside were shelves stacked with old files, boxes of equipment he never used, and coats he forgot existed. He scanned the floor instinctively, and there, tucked between a storage box and the wall, lay another scrap of paper. He reached for it, his pulse quickening with the dread of what it might reveal. But when he opened it, he froze. A drawing, a simple line sketch, a small figure curled in a corner, a larger figure standing far away, facing the opposite direction, and beneath the drawing, in tiny letters, "I wait." Leonard's throat tightened painfully. The child had been leaving a trail, notes, drawings, signs, and he had walked through this house blind to all of them. The mansion wasn't just empty of voices. It was empty of presence. Empty of connection, empty of him. He stepped out of the closet abruptly, almost stumbling as the air felt too thick to inhale. The notes were scattered across the desk now, forming a mosaic of her silent suffering. A child had tried to communicate in the only way she knew how, leaving pieces of herself tucked into the quiet corners of his world. And he had missed every single one. As he reached the doorway, ready to search the next room, a flicker of movement outside the window caught his attention. The curtains swayed slightly, though the window was closed. Something, or someone, had brushed past the glass. He stepped closer, peering into the dim yard. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the property where the shadows deepened, he caught the faintest glimpse of a small figure moving carefully along the side of the house. She wasn't gone, she was moving again, guided by fear, guided by instinct, guided by a lifetime of going unnoticed. And now he had to follow, because her next hiding place might reveal more than scraps and whispers. It might reveal why she believed the man never saw her, and whether he still had time to change that. Letting him find where she truly hid. Leonard stood in the center of his office, surrounded by the scrap notes scattered across the desk like fragments of a life he hadn't bothered to see. Each one exposed a part of her struggle, her hunger, her dizziness, her attempts to stay warm, her confusion, her loneliness. But it was the final note, the one whispering, "The man never sees me," that settled deepest inside him. He had spent years believing he was a good provider, a responsible adult building a future for a child he barely knew how to reach. He measured fatherhood by stability, by financial security, by the belief that a safe home mattered more than the presence inside it. But this home, the pristine, polished mansion he thought represented safety, had never kept her warm, never eased her hunger, never quieted her fears. He had mistaken shelter for comfort, mistaken money for care. And in that mistake, he had built a life that looked whole from the outside but left enormous fractures inside its walls. He gathered the notes slowly, one by one, stacking them with trembling hands as if they were brittle enough to crumble under pressure. They were pieces of truth he had avoided for too long, truth that a child had tried to deliver in secret, hoping someone would notice before she faded completely into the shadows. He looked around the office with new clarity. The tall windows, the towering bookshelves, the expensive desk, none of it mattered. None of it ever had. He saw now how easily the house had become a symbol of the life he lived independently, not the life he shared. It echoed his absence more than it reflected his success. He walked through the hallway next, moving slowly, almost hesitantly, like someone stepping into a memory rather than a space he owned. The walls felt narrower now, the air heavier. The house that once seemed expansive now felt like a labyrinth of empty corners where a child had hidden more often than she had rested. He paused at the foot of the staircase. The stairs looked ordinary at first glance, but he noticed faint marks on the railing, a small smear of dirt at the height of a tiny hand, a faint scuff on the edge of a step, a scratched line along the wood. They weren't damages made by accident, they were traces of someone navigating this staircase in fear or discomfort, someone who wasn't meant to be there but came anyway. His stomach twisted. How many times had she climbed these stairs quietly, cautiously, listening for the creak of each step? How many nights had she wandered the hallway above, searching for warmth or comfort in rooms that never welcomed her? How often had she been this close to him, close enough to hear him move through the house, while he remained blissfully unaware of her existence? He ascended the stairs slowly, his hand trailing along the railing as though tracing her steps backward in time. At the top, the hallway stretched before him, long and dim, the doors on either side closed tightly. He remembered walking this hallway during inspections, after renovations, when he hired cleaners. But he had never walked it with intention, never studied it with the eyes of someone searching for signs of a child living there in secret. He stepped toward the first door and opened it. A guest room, clean, untouched, cold. Nothing inside suggested life or movement. He closed the door and moved on, opening each room as he went. Another guest room, another empty space, a linen closet, a storage nook, all neat, all silent. The silence was beginning to taunt him. He reached the room at the far end, the one closest to the attic entry. Something about it felt different before he even opened the door. The air around it was stiller somehow, as though holding a secret suspended behind the wood. He pushed the door gently. It creaked. Inside, the room was nearly empty except for a chair pushed awkwardly against the wall. The curtain hung unevenly, one side slightly lifted as though someone had peeked out from beneath it. The floor bore faint marks, tiny footprints smeared slightly with dirt, leading toward the corner where a shadow seemed darker than it should. Leonard stepped closer, knees heavy, breath shallow. Behind the chair, he found more, crumbs on the floor near the baseboard, a bottle cap, the faint outline of a child's hand pressed into dust. She had been here, recently. He turned slowly, surveying the room as though piecing together a timeline she was too young to articulate. He walked to the wall where faint smudges formed a trail up the paint, the height slowly increasing as though she had climbed onto the chair to reach something. What had she been searching for? A place to hide, a view of the outside, a way to feel connected to a life she never got to join. He glanced upward, and then he saw it. The attic door, a simple square panel in the ceiling, with a small cord hanging down slightly crooked. He stepped beneath it, heart hammering. The cord swayed faintly as though touched recently. The air was colder here, the ceiling casting a faint shadow over him. He reached up, touching the cord gently. It was warm, not from the house's heating system, warm from recent contact. Someone small had pulled it. Someone searching for another hidden space. He tugged gently. The attic door creaked open, the wooden ladder unfolding with a slow, groaning resistance. A wave of cooler air drifted down, carrying with it the faint smell of dust, old insulation, and something else, something human. Something lived in. He climbed the first step cautiously, then another. His head rose level with the attic floor. It was dark except for a thin line of moonlight slipping through a narrow vent. The dust on the floor was scattered, uneven, disrupted by movement far too recent to be ignored. Small footprints traced scattered paths, light, careful steps of someone moving quietly through shadows. He climbed up fully, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The attic stretched out before him, a cavern of shadows and forgotten belongings. But it wasn't the space that made him freeze. It was the sound, soft, faint, a tiny shuffle in the far corner, almost like fabric brushing against wood. He held his breath, the truth settling cold and heavy in his bones. She was here, somewhere in this darkness, somewhere within reach after he'd missed her for so long. A soft exhale drifted from the shadows, barely audible, yet unmistakably human. Leonard took one slow step forward, and the faint sound from the attic stopped him in his tracks. Leonard remained absolutely still, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat as the faint sound in the attic faded back into silence. The dimness around him pressed close, thick with the dust of years and the quiet imprint of someone far smaller who had moved through this space long before he ever thought to check it. The wooden beams above creaked softly, adjusting to the night air, but beneath those natural groans lay something else, an atmosphere shaped by presence, by nights spent awake, by fear that had no place to go except into the shadows. His eyes adjusted slowly, revealing the contours of the attic. Boxes piled in careless stacks. Old furniture covered in blankets. Forgotten electronics. Seasonal decorations. Each item formed part of a cluttered landscape that he had mentally erased from his life. He had no reason to come up here. No memories tied to it. No interest in the dust or the cold. But she had. And now he needed to see what she had seen, feel what she had felt, understand why this attic, forgotten by him, had become a refuge for her. He took a few cautious steps forward, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. He moved slowly, not out of fear of falling but out of fear of disturbing the delicate traces she might have left behind. He scanned the floor for small signs, an impression in dust, a tiny footprint, a place where dust thinned just enough to indicate movement. Then he saw it, near the far corner, where two beams met and cast a slanted line of shadow, a faint circular pattern marked the floorboards. Dust cleared slightly in the middle, edges smudged by repeated contact. A small indentation that looked like the shape of someone sitting, knees pulled up, back hunched, arms wrapped around themselves for warmth. He followed the faint trail leading there, feeling as though he were tracing her steps weeks, maybe months late. The cold grew sharper as he approached. The vent on the far wall let in a thin blade of winter air, carrying the crispness of the night directly into the attic. No child should have endured hours up here. Yet she had. He reached the spot and lowered himself slowly, one knee touching the floor. From this angle, the attic transformed. It wasn't just a storage space, it was a vantage point. Through the narrow slits in the wooden slats, someone small could see slivers of the house below. The hallway light seeping through cracks. The soft glow from the office. Even faint movements if the shadows aligned just right. She could watch him without being seen. She could listen to the hum of his life from above. She could stay near him while never feeling permitted to be with him. The thought made his chest tighten painfully. He scanned the area further. A tiny patch of carpet, torn from somewhere else, lay tucked beside the beam, smoothed flat as though someone used it to soften the cold boards. A small plastic cup sat overturned nearby, dust clinging to its rim. A loose bead, perhaps from an old toy or bracelet, rested alone in the corner. These weren't trash items. They were keepsakes, tools of survival, tiny comforts scavenged from forgotten places. She'd made a space for herself. A fragile one, but hers. Leonard's breath wavered as he imagined her curled there, trying to stay warm, listening to the house shift while he moved freely below without knowing she was just feet above him. What thoughts had lingered in her mind as she waited? What fears kept her awake? What hopes made her climb the ladder night after night? He reached toward the patch of carpet and lifted it. Beneath it, the floorboard was slightly more worn, as if she'd pressed her palms there repeatedly, maybe bracing herself during dizzy spells, maybe grounding herself through fear. His hands trembled as he lowered the carpet back into place gently, as though disturbing it too much would erase the only trace she'd left of comfort. He turned toward the cluttered corner where objects under old sheets rested in silent mounds. Something drew his attention, an uneven fold in the dusty material, a subtle bump near the bottom that didn't match the shape of the object beneath it. It looked recent, like something had been placed there intentionally, hidden, not part of the old storage. He approached slowly, aware again of that faint sound he had heard earlier. It could have come from here, from something settling, from someone hiding, but now, all he saw was stillness, shadows stretching across covered furniture in soft, sloping lines. He reached out and lifted the edge of the old sheet. Dust rose softly into the air, swirling in the narrow beam of moonlight that filtered through the vent. The object beneath was not large, just a wooden box, similar in age to the rest of the attic's storage but strangely out of place. It wasn't where it should be. It wasn't covered in thick dust like everything else. It had been moved recently, handled recently, used recently. Leonard knelt, heart thudding in slow, heavy beats. He brushed off the thin layer of dust from the top and saw faint fingerprints, small ones, along the lid. His throat tightened. He opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled against the wooden interior, were several small items arranged with care, a half-used candle with melted wax hardened along its base. 2 coins she must have found somewhere, kept as treasures. A small wrapper folded neatly, as if it once held a rare piece of food. A button she likely picked up from a floor or sidewalk. And a torn photograph. He froze. The photograph was faded, its edges frayed, the image partial. But he recognized it. He saw himself, much younger, smiling at the camera, holding a toddler in his arms. The edges of the photo were torn, but the small arm clinging to his neck was unmistakable. The child's face was missing from the torn section, but the outline of the hair, the curve of the cheek. He didn't need the missing half to know who it was. It was her. It was his daughter. His breath fractured. His heart sank. The room tilted slightly as reality crashed into him. She hadn't just survived near his home. She belonged to his home. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a random child lost in the shadows of wealth. She was his child, his blood, the little girl he had once held in that photograph. And she had been living in the corners of his house. Alone, hungry, cold, invisible. Leonard closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by the collapse of every assumption he'd made. The story wasn't about a child seeking scraps from a stranger's trash. It was about a daughter seeking remnants from a father who never realized she needed him. His pulse hammered as he set the photograph down gently, afraid that touching it too long would break him further. Then, a soft thump, quick, deliberate, from beneath another sheet on the opposite side of the attic. He turned sharply, heart pounding, breath catching in his chest. Something had shifted. Not an item, not the house. Something, or someone, was beneath that sheet. Waiting. For several seconds, Leonard could only stare at the sheet that had moved. The attic, once nothing more than a dusty part of a large home, felt suddenly alive with truth, raw, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Every breath he took felt thick with the weight of realization. The items in the small wooden box, the torn photograph, the impressions in the dust, they all pointed toward the same devastating conclusion. She had been here not because she was lost, but because she belonged here. Because she had nowhere else to go. Because he had not seen what was right in front of him. He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet attic. He moved toward the sheet slowly, cautious not to startle whoever, or whatever, hid beneath it. Each step reminded him of the night outside, of her fragile voice drifting through the cold air. "Dad, I can't see straight." The words had sounded like a momentary weakness then, something temporary, maybe even just fatigue. But now they rang differently. Sharper, more frightening. They weren't words of complaint. They were symptoms, warnings. He reached the corner of the sheet and lifted it gently. Beneath it was no hiding child but a collapsed piece of furniture, an old trunk pushed over recently, dust disturbed around it. The sound he heard had been the trunk shifting under the weight of something else earlier, likely when she navigated the space. The realization eased the tension in his muscles only slightly, but it brought him closer to understanding the heartbreaking pattern of her movements. He stepped around the trunk, scanning the rest of the attic again. Her footprints, small, uneven, scattered, told a story of hesitancy. She had wandered here not freely but cautiously, each step uncertain. And woven into her movements were signs of dizziness, marks where she leaned against walls, smudges where she steadied herself with her hands, small circular impressions where she had crouched suddenly. The whisper she spoke outside, the plea that sounded so soft, so fragile, now echoed through every trace she'd left in this house. "Dad, I can't see straight." It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was hunger, prolonged hunger, a hunger deep enough to affect vision, balance, breathing. He knew the signs now. He had read them in reports and charity cases, not expecting ever to see them in his own home. Long-term malnutrition caused dizziness. It blurred vision, it weakened limbs, it slowed thinking, it made the world tilt sideways, especially when the body was young and fragile. And all the notes she left. My head spins, hungry again, too cold, hurts to sleep, I hide when I feel sick. They were not random complaints. They were the daily symptoms of a child surviving on scraps. A child whose basic needs were unmet for far too long. He pressed a hand against his forehead, his palm cold, his pulse unsteady. Had she fainted here before? Had she spent nights in darkness, trembling, waiting for her vision to steady enough to climb back down? Had she hidden in the attic even while he was just below her, unaware of the small body trying to stay conscious? He stepped deeper into the attic, following the faint footprints toward a far corner where a makeshift nest had formed, a place she had tried to make comfortable. A small pillow missing its casing, a thin blanket bunched unevenly, a plastic cup, an old stuffed animal missing one ear, its fur matted and gray from years of exposure. He crouched beside it, his fingertips brushed the pillow lightly. The fabric was cold. When he touched the blanket, he felt the thinness immediately. This was not enough to keep her warm. This was not enough to comfort her. This was not enough for a child trying to survive in the cold outline of a house that didn't know she was here. He sat back on his heels, his throat tight. The attic wasn't just a hiding place, it was a sick room, a waiting room, a place where a child suffering hunger tried to stay quiet enough not to draw attention. He imagined her curled here, shaking, her vision blurring, whispering aloud only because the world around her was spinning, "Dad, I can't see straight." The memory of her voice echoed so powerfully that he almost turned, expecting to see her beside him. But the attic was empty, and that emptiness hit him harder than any spoken accusation ever could. He stood, wiping the dust from his hands. He needed to find her. Now, before her unsteady steps led her somewhere dangerous. Before dizziness made her collapse. Before hunger forced her into another hiding spot where he might not find her in time. He headed for the ladder, moving faster this time, urgency replacing caution. But halfway down, he froze. The air in the hallway felt different. Cooler. A draft moved past him, faint but noticeable, the kind that came when a door somewhere had been opened. He stepped onto the hallway floor, scanning the space. The house was silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt tense, expectant, as though the house itself sensed what he now knew. He moved quickly down the hall, calling her name in his mind even though he wasn't ready to say it aloud. His footsteps were steady, but inside he felt unbalanced, afraid of what he might, or might not, find. He turned the corner into the main hallway and stopped. The front door remained closed. The back door was still latched. Nothing downstairs stirred, but then he noticed it, something small near the base of the refrigerator. A crumb, a faint smear, something pale, like residue from bread. A tiny handprint, so small it barely registered. She had been downstairs, recently, and she was hungry enough to look for food again. He moved into the kitchen quickly, scanning the countertops, the drawers, the floor. Then he saw it. The cabinet under the sink was slightly ajar. He pulled it open and found the recycling bin disturbed, papers pushed aside. More crumbs. A wrapper. She had been searching for food there. She hadn't eaten today. He knew that now with a certainty that made his stomach twist painfully. She was getting weaker. Her dizziness was increasing. Her steps were growing more uneven. Every minute mattered. He straightened, his heart pounding steadily, loudly, drowning out every other sound in the silent house. He had wasted years not seeing her. He couldn't afford to waste seconds now. He turned toward the hallway, determination stiffening his spine, and then he saw it. A faint trail on the kitchen floor. A disturbed line of dust leading toward the back door. And beside it, a small, shaky footprint. She was still moving, still searching, still deteriorating, and if he didn't find her now, the house that had swallowed her presence might swallow her strength next. Leonard stood in the kitchen with the faint, dusty footprint at his feet, and for the first time in years, his world narrowed into a single, urgent purpose: find her before her body failed her. The house, once a monument to achievement, now felt like a massive, hollow place that had swallowed her needs, her hunger, her dizziness, her silent pleas. He followed the faint trail across the tile, reading the small disturbances in dust and crumbs like a map she'd left unintentionally, a map not of escape, but of desperation. She had tried to find food. She had tried not to be seen. She had tried to stay alive. His chest tightened painfully as he moved through the hallway, eyes scanning the floors, corners, door frames. Every small mark mattered now. The faint drag of a shoe on the baseboard. A tiny smudge of dirt on the lower wall. A curtain shifted just enough to suggest someone brushed past it. Signs of her presence, subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. But he was looking now with a clarity sharpened by guilt and fear. He traced the trail into the living room. The faint imprint of her hand on the back of a chair. A cushion slightly dented, a spot on the rug where her knees had pressed in. She moved slowly, unsteadily, each clue a testament to how weak she had grown. From the living room, the trail led toward the sliding door that opened to the backyard. The lock was still in place, but the dust near the bottom of the frame was disturbed, as if she had pressed her fingers there while deciding whether to go outside. The hesitation in that moment carved into him. He unlocked the door and stepped out into the cool evening air, the sudden temperature shift reminding him of just how fragile she must have felt. The yard stretched before him in muted tones, the moonlight casting pale glimmers across the grass. The manicured lines of hedges and flower beds looked almost accusatory, beauty he maintained while she searched for crumbs. He moved across the patio slowly at first, scanning the ground. A faint dip in the grass caught his eye. She had stepped here, then another, slightly off balance, showing she wobbled as she walked. The imprints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. She had passed through not long before he discovered the trail in the kitchen. He followed the footprints toward the side of the yard where the shadows deepened near the fence. A cold breeze pressed against him, carrying the scent of soil and pine. Her footsteps grew fainter in the grass, but the signs of her presence continued. A small indentation near the garden path, a faint scratch on the wooden trellis, a leaf pressed flat where she must have sat for a moment. It was becoming clear that she had paused often, either to steady herself or because exhaustion forced her to stop. The thought made him move faster. He reached the far end of the yard where the utility structure and garden shed stood, quiet, tucked into the landscape as though intentionally hidden. He had barely noticed them over the years except when pruning the edges. But she had known them intimately. She had lived near them, slept beside them, found shelter in their forgotten corners. The night air thickened as he approached the shed. He slowed, listening. The faint hum of crickets filled the distance. The rustle of leaves, the gentle creak of an old branch. But beneath those natural sounds, something else lingered, a soft scuff, a subtle shift, a movement too deliberate to be the wind. He stepped closer, heart pounding. The shed looked exactly as it always had, old, weathered, with the paint peeling along its edges and the roof sagging slightly. Yet now it felt different, charged with meaning, heavy with the presence of someone who had used it for survival. He reached the narrow space beside the shed where she had hidden her blanket earlier, where he had found signs of her sleeping. The ground there carried new marks. A small smudge, darker than the rest of the soil. A disturbed patch of grass. A footprint tilting to the side, as if she stumbled. He crouched, running his fingers lightly across the earth. The faint dampness on the ground mixed with the dryness near the edges suggested she had been there after the grass dried but before the night air settled. Not hours ago. Less. His pulse surged. He stood quickly and moved toward the shed door. As he reached for the handle, that sound returned, a faint, almost imperceptible shift from inside. It wasn't loud, it wasn't alarming, but it was unmistakably real. He froze, listening more closely. The sound came again, a gentle scrape against the wooden floor, a soft thud as if something lightweight shifted, a rhythmic pattern inconsistent with the natural settling of boards. His breath tightened. Was it her? Had she crawled inside the shed, seeking shelter after failing to find food? Had her dizziness grown so strong that she collapsed within its shadows? He imagined her curled inside, vision blurred, hands trembling, body weakened by hunger. The thought pushed him forward. He pulled the shed door open slowly. The hinges groaned under the strain, the interior revealed inch by inch. The air inside was colder, tinged with the musty scent of old tools, soil, and damp wood. Moonlight filtered in through the small gaps in the planks, creating strips of light across the dusty floor. He stepped inside. At first, he saw nothing but the tools hanging along the wall, the garden supplies, the clutter of years gone unused. But then he saw it, a small footprint in the dust near the corner. Then another, and another, each one wobbly, each one pointing toward the far end of the shed. He followed them, his heart pounding in his ears. Then he heard it, a sound too faint to ignore. A small exhale, a soft shifting of weight, a whisper of movement that confirmed everything he feared. She was here, weak, dizzy, hiding, trying to fight hunger with silence. And as Leonard stood there in the dim shed, realizing he was only steps away from the daughter he had failed to see for so long, the next sound he heard made his blood run cold. The air inside the shed felt heavier than anywhere else in the yard, a stagnant chill that wrapped around Leonard as he stood frozen near the doorway. He could hear his own breathing, uneven and strained, mixing with the faint, fragile sound coming from the corner where her footprints led. This was no longer just a search. It was a reckoning, a confrontation not with her, but with himself, with the father he thought he had been and the father he had actually been. He stepped deeper into the shed, eyes scanning the shadows with growing urgency. The tools hanging on the wall cast thin, stretched silhouettes across the floor, bending with the slanted moonlight. But underneath those long lines, near the far corner, was a shape small enough to break him completely. She was there, curled tightly between two crates, her knees tucked to her chest, her arms wrapped around him as though trying to shelter what little warmth she had left. The hood of her worn sweatshirt covered most of her face, but the tremor in her body gave away everything. She couldn't speak. She breathed in shallow pulls, uneven and soft, the kind of breaths that came from exhaustion rather than rest. Leonard didn't move for a moment. Not because he hesitated, but because the sight stripped him of breath. The weight of every missed moment, every dinner he skipped, every bedtime story he didn't read, every morning he rushed through, settled on him like a collapsing world. She hadn't feared him. She had feared being unseen by him, feared being forgotten, feared being alone in a home where she should have felt protected. Everything he had discovered in the house, the scrap notes, the bruised hands, the hiding spots, pointed to the same truth. She didn't avoid him because he was dangerous. She avoided him because he wasn't there. Not in the ways that mattered. Not in the moments she needed softness, guidance, or simply a voice that told her she mattered. Her body shifted slightly, a weak adjustment, her shoulder brushing the crate beside her. Her fingers twitched near her knees, small motions betraying the dizziness still overwhelming her. Hunger had stripped her energy. Cold had taken her focus. Fear had shaped her instincts. And now, she lay in the corner of a shed, his shed, trying to stay awake in a world that kept forgetting she existed. Leonard crouched slowly, lowering himself until he was at her level. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if any sudden gesture would scatter the fragile trust she had left. He didn't speak. Words felt too big, too loud for the small, shivering presence before him. Instead, he allowed silence to settle, a silence that wasn't empty this time, but present. She lifted her head slightly, her hood falling back enough for him to see her eyes. They were unfocused at first, struggling to make sense of the dim light and the figure approaching her. But then recognition flickered, not relief, not fear, something gentler, something hesitant, something that said she wasn't sure if this was another moment where she would be unseen, or the moment she had been waiting for all along. She blinked slowly, her vision wavering. He could see the effort it took just to hold her gaze. He remembered her whisper outside, "Dad, I can't see straight," and the realization hit him again with sharper force. Her body wasn't just tired. It was failing, from hunger, from lack of warmth, from too many nights spent curled in corners. He exhaled shakily and extended a hand toward her, not to pull, not to force, but to offer. A gesture that said he wasn't walking away this time. That he wasn't blind anymore. That he saw her, truly saw her. She stared at his hand for several seconds, breathing quietly. Her fingers flexed slightly, the tremor in them more pronounced now. She looked at his face again, searching it with slow, uncertain eyes. Searching for consistency, for the father she remembered from the torn photograph, for the father she hoped he could be. Then, hesitantly, she lifted her hand. Not quickly, not confidently, but bravely. Her small fingers settled into his palm, barely curling. The light touch felt impossibly fragile. Leonard closed his hand around hers gently, not gripping, only supporting, letting her know she didn't need to carry her weight alone anymore. He shifted closer, offering the warmth of his presence, letting her lean against him. When her forehead touched his chest, her entire body trembled with relief so quiet and so small that it nearly broke him. He lifted her slowly, carefully, feeling how light she was, far too light. Her head rested against his shoulder, and her hand clung weakly to his shirt. Not out of fear, out of trust, trust she had held onto even when hunger blurred her vision and loneliness blurred her world. As he stepped out of the shed, the cold night air felt different, crisper, sharper, more alive. The world outside seemed to pause, as though aware that something monumental was shifting. The yard felt less like a landscape and more like a witness to every moment she had spent hidden. He walked toward the house with her held securely in his arms, her breaths warm but faint against his collar. Every step he took felt like moving toward a promise, one he hadn't made before, one he intended to keep now. The lights from the house cast soft patterns on the lawn, illuminating the path ahead. He felt her stir slightly, her fingers tightening just enough to say she knew he was there. She knew he wasn't letting go. At the back door, he paused. Not out of fear, not out of doubt, but out of understanding. This moment, right here, with her weight against him, with her trust trembling in his arms, was the moment a father chose to show up. As he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the home he had ignored for far too long, he felt the truth settle into him with undeniable force. This was the boundary between who he had been and who he had to become. And he knew, down to his core, that whatever happened next would determine whether he became the father she remembered from a torn photograph, or the father she finally deserved. As he carried her back inside, the silence between them didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a promise he finally intended to keep. The house that once hid her suffering now stood as a reminder of every moment he failed to see. She had survived hunger, loneliness, and cold not because she was strong, but because she had no choice. Now, for the first time, she wasn't walking alone. And as he held her tighter, he understood the truth he'd ignored for years. Being her father didn't start with money, it started with showing up. If stories like this hit you the way they hit me, make sure you don't keep this one to yourself. Someone you know needs to hear it too. I share moments that challenge how we see family, responsibility, and the quiet battles people fight right next to us. Stick around, because there's a lot more coming that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And before you scroll, tell me this: which country are you watching from, and how did this story hit you?